I've come to Jerusalem to better understand who Jesus of Nazareth was by examining what scholars believe is the earliest account of his life, the Gospel of Mark. In this episode, we'll consider why did Jesus come here to Jerusalem at the beginning of Passover week 2,000 years ago? Had he come like his fellow Jews simply to celebrate the Passover meal? Or had he in fact come here to declare himself to be the long-awaited Messianic King? This is a pivotal question, and one we must answer if we want to understand Mark's Gospel. And so in order to answer it, we're going to retrace the steps of Jesus from his arrival on the Mount of Olives until he was arrested later that week in the Garden of Gethsemane. There's no more spectacular view full of religious history and meaning than the ancient walls of Jerusalem and the glistening dome of the rock that now stands upon it. Although much has changed over the last 2,000 years, the view from the Mount of Olives still takes your breath away when you see it. It's fascinating to think that it was here that so many stories in the Bible took place. It was here that Abraham came to offer his son Isaac, and where God intervened, promising he would provide the sacrifice himself. It's here that David established the capital of his kingdom, and where his son Solomon built the temple. And it is within these walls that prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah proclaim the word of the Lord. It sends chills up my spine just thinking that I'm standing so close to where God revealed himself in a unique way down through the centuries. Jews had this same sense of excitement as they traveled to Jerusalem in order to celebrate the Passover. Yet, as exciting as it was for pilgrims to glimpse the walls of the holy city, there was even a greater sense of anticipation with those who traveled with Jesus to this spot on the Sunday before Passover. They were excited because they believed that Jesus had come to Jerusalem to finally declare his claim to the throne of David. The story begins, however, with a rather bizarre mission that Jesus gives two of his disciples as they reach Bethphage and Bethany, two cities just on the other side of the Mount of Olives.
Go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, "Why are you doing this?" say, "The Lord has need of it, and will send it back here immediately."
The disciples do just as Jesus instructs. When they return with the animal, which was likely a young donkey, they throw their cloaks on its back. After getting on the animal, Jesus then rides into Jerusalem. Why did Jesus instruct the disciples to do this for him? He could have easily picked up the animal himself as he walked through the village. And why did he specifically want an animal that had never been ridden before? But even more basic than that, why did Jesus actually want to ride into Jerusalem in the first place? But Jesus didn't want to ride a donkey because he was tired. He had spent the Sabbath in Bethany, so he would have been well rested after his journey up from Jericho the day before. But more importantly, Jerusalem is only 2 miles away from Bethany. And here from the slopes of the Mount of Olives, you can tell that it's basically downhill the entire way. So why did Jesus enter into Jerusalem riding on a donkey? It's because he wanted to make a statement. And he wanted his disciples to recognize that his decision to enter Jerusalem on that donkey was not an accident or some sort of spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a significant event, one that was carefully planned for and arranged in advance. What was that event? We find the answer in the way Mark records the crowd's response.
And many spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut from the fields. And those who went before and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest.
Jesus wanted his entry into Jerusalem to be understood as a messianic event, the long-awaited return of the Davidic king, and that's clearly how the people understood it. They were filled with excitement as they believed that the messianic hope of deliverance was being fulfilled in front of their very eyes, and it was taking place at the time of the Passover itself. Jesus, the Son of David, was coming in the name of the Lord, and he was bringing with him the messianic kingdom that he had proclaimed throughout his ministry. When Matthew writes his account years later, he makes this messianic connection even more explicit by identifying it as a fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9, the prophecy that the king would come to Zion riding on a donkey. Since Jesus does nothing to discourage the exuberant response of the people, it's clear that he approved of his entry into Jerusalem being understood as a messianic act. Although Jesus did not openly proclaim himself to be the king at that moment, the people recognized that something significant was soon to take place during Passover week. And what Jesus did the next day on the Temple Mount would not only encourage those with messianic expectations even more, but it would put him on a collision course with the ruling authorities in the temple, the Sadducees. There's no more sacred space in all the world for Jews than the remains of the ancient walls of the Temple Mount. Jews and Gentiles come here today from all over the world, just like they did at the time of Jesus. They come here desiring to experience a closeness with God. The area is divided into a section for men and a section for women. To give you a better view of it, I'd like to go down into the men's section. I'm standing in front of a small portion of the remains of the western wall at the Temple Mount. These stones were carved and put in place by order of Herod the Great when he rebuilt this entire complex. We know these are Herod's stones because of their distinct style. The style is this border that frames the entire stone. The smaller stones above were erected later by the Muslims and the Crusaders when they tried to rebuild the wall that the Romans had destroyed. In the crowd, especially on a Friday night, you'll see all kinds of different Jews. Most of them are Orthodox. They're the modern descendants of the Pharisees. The various groups of Orthodox Jews can be identified by the different style of clothing they wear. This scene would have looked very similar when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. But instead of the different kinds of modern Jews, Jesus would have seen members of the various schools of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and just regular Jewish people who had come to the temple to worship. Modern Jews come to the Western Wall to pray. They write out their prayers on little pieces of paper in advance and then leave them in crevices in the wall. They also come here to circumcise Jewish boys and to celebrate bar and bat mitzvahs, the celebration when Jewish children legally reach the age when they could decide to follow God's law for themselves. When Jesus came to the temple, he would not have come here, however. He would have entered with the rest of the pilgrims at the main entrance, which is on the southern side of the Temple Mount. And that's where I'd like us to go next. I'm standing on the stairs that once led to the main entrance to the Temple Mount. Jesus would have climbed these stairs and entered the temple through what was once a triple gate at the top, but which today has been blocked off. As its remains still show, the Temple Mount was magnificent. It was the largest religious complex ever built, and it was virtually brand new. A generation before Jesus was born, Herod the Great had massively rebuilt the temple that dated back to after the Babylonian exile. What we see today is just the remains of that expanded foundation, the platform on which Herod rebuilt the temple. That foundation is called the Temple Mount, and it's gigantic. The complex covers about 35 acres, and the original wall surrounding the Temple Mount stood 100 feet above ground and another 60 feet below ground. The temple itself was even taller, standing at 150 feet. It was located somewhere near the place where we now see the Dome of the Rock in the middle of the Temple Mount. When Jesus entered through the triple gates, he would have entered through an underground passage and have come out into the largest area of the Temple Mount, the area known as the Court of the Gentiles. Both Jews and Gentiles had access to this portion of the Temple Mount. Today, this area is occupied by Muslims, and we can still see how large the court of the Gentiles was. It included a covered portico around the perimeter that was 45 feet wide, with columns that were 35 feet tall. The royal stoa on the south side was even larger. Although the court of the Gentiles surrounded the temple, there was a small wall separating it from the area closest to the temple, where only Jews were allowed access. It would have been roughly where we see this small wall here before the stairs that lead up to the Dome of the Rock. Inside this area, there was a court for women, and just beyond it was one for Jewish men. And beyond that was the temple itself, where only priests could enter, and where only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies. While the Temple Mount was always full of people, when Jesus entered it that morning, it would have been packed more than usual with thousands of Jews who had come to Jerusalem for Passover, as well as for Roman soldiers who were there to monitor the crowds. Many of the pilgrims would have been Jewish males who were required to pay a half-shekel tax. While they could pay the tax in advance without traveling to Jerusalem, it was considered a sacred honor to pay it in person at the Passover festival. In addition to the half-shekel tax, Jews were also required to offer the appropriate, blemish-free sacrifice at the temple for Passover. Depending on a family's economic status, different animals were required. For some it might be an oxen. If it was a poor family, just some small pigeons. But for most people, it was a sheep. According to ancient Jewish sources, the shops where these officially certified animals were sold were originally located on the Mount of Olives. But in order to profit from the sale of all the animals, the Sadducees, who were in charge of the temple and known for being corrupt, relocated those shops and all their animals to an area in the court of the Gentiles. This would not have only filled the court of the Gentiles with a bedlam of noise, but it would have also turned a large portion of it into a virtual zoo. It was hardly the kind of atmosphere appropriate for a place of worship. When Jesus saw what was taking place in the court of the Gentiles, Mark records that he became very angry.
And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers."
What made Jesus so upset was that the ruling authorities were treating the area in the temple dedicated for Gentile worship as though it were of no significance, as though the Gentiles were of little importance in the eyes of God. But Jesus was opposed to this way of thinking. The temple was supposed to be a place of prayer and worship for all people. In fact, the Old Testament verses that Jesus quotes, Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11, predicted that it was from the temple that the light of God's glory was to go to all the nations. But instead of welcoming the Gentiles here and giving them a place to worship, the Sadducees desecrated the area by treating it as a place of mere commerce for buying and selling. Little has changed today regarding who has access to certain parts of the temple and who doesn't. Some Jewish women are outraged that access to the Western Wall, which is controlled by ultra-Orthodox Jews, is divided according to gender. Not only is the women's section smaller, but women are not permitted to read aloud from the Torah, to wear prayer shawls, or even to sing in that section. And joint services between men and women are also not allowed along the main portion of the Western Wall. Other Jews are upset that the state of Israel respects the sanctity of the Temple Mount for Muslims, but limits the number of Jews who can visit the site and prohibits Jews from performing any sort of religious activity on the Temple Mount. Certain Jewish groups are defiant that the Temple Mount belongs to them and not Muslims. Jesus was outraged that the religious authorities had failed to make the temple a place of prayer for all people. And when the Sadducees heard that Jesus had driven out the money changers and the merchants, they were furious with him.
And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching.
What was it about the actions of Jesus in the temple that turned the ruling religious authorities so decisively against him? The answer is found in what happened when Jesus returned to the temple later.
And as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, "By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them?"
While the religious authorities were certainly opposed to the teachings of Jesus, they were far more concerned by his actions when he climbed these steps and entered into the temple. Why had Jesus taken justice into his own hands by driving out the merchants himself? Instead of overturning the tables and causing such a public spectacle, Jesus could have just condemned the events. Like the prophet Jeremiah, he could have publicly condemned what happened to the temple by addressing the crowds that were there that day. Or for that matter, he could have simply have registered a complaint with the temple authorities themselves. But Jesus did neither of those things, and that's what worried the temple priests. Just who did Jesus think he was to act in that manner? He wasn't a Levite, so he wasn't a priest. There was only one other answer to that question of whose authority that Jesus acted in, and the temple priests wanted to hear the answer from Jesus himself so they could publicly take action against him. But Jesus refused to answer their question. In taking charge in the temple, Jesus was acting as if he had authority over the temple. Outside of the priests who were responsible for the temple and its services, the only other person who had authority over the temple was the king of Israel. It was King David who planned the temple, and his son Solomon who exercised his authority in building the temple. It was the boy kings Joash and Josiah who cleansed the temple and restored its services. So in acting as he did, Jesus was not only challenging the priests at the very center of their authority, which would have been bad enough in their opinion, but he was assuming the authority of a king. His action was clearly a messianic action, just like he had done the day before when he entered into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. The fact that Jesus refused to answer their question confirmed their greatest worries. And in their opinion, Jesus needed to be stopped no matter the cost. And as Jesus continued to speak out against the temple, even declaring that the temple would be destroyed and all of its magnificent buildings, they felt they needed to act, and to act soon. Like the crowds of people that thronged around Jesus from Galilee, the priests were certain that Jesus, who they believed was nothing more than a religious charlatan, was about to declare himself to be the Messianic king. And since a king is someone who fights in order to deliver his people from their enemies, they feared that Jesus was about to launch a revolt against the Romans, and they were determined to make sure that that didn't happen. With the popularity of Jesus at an all-time high among the people, how could the ruling religious authorities arrest Jesus without causing the very uprising they were desperately trying to avoid? Many who know the story would probably say that the reason Jesus was arrested and crucified was because of the carefully laid plans of the religious authorities and his betrayal by Judas. But that's not the way the earliest gospel tells the story. According to Mark, the reason Jesus was crucified was because of a decision that he made here in the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. But before we can understand what happened that night, we first need to understand the context in which Jesus understood and carried out his ministry. Throughout his story of Jesus' ministry, Mark recounts a number of times when Jesus intimated that he knew his ministry was on a confrontation path with the Jewish authorities that would lead to his ultimate arrest and his execution in Jerusalem.
And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes. And they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Jesus had come to believe that it was only through his arrest and death that the people of God could truly be delivered. His views were rooted in his understanding of the purpose of the Jewish sacrificial system and his understanding of the suffering servant of the Lord in Isaiah 53. But Jesus' talk about his suffering and dying made no sense to his disciples. How could his death actually bring about deliverance? Was all this talk of his dying and rising simply some kind of metaphor to describe a transition in his life from his humble beginnings in Galilee to what they believed would be his coronation in Jerusalem as the long-awaited Messianic king? They didn't know what he was talking about, and they were also too afraid to ask him. While Jesus made these sorts of comments throughout his entire ministry, his clearest statements about it occurred on the night he was arrested, when he celebrated the Passover meal with his disciples in the upper room. We refer to that event as the Lord's Supper.
And as they were eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
Over 1,000 years later, the Crusaders decided that this room marks the location where that fateful meal took place. As we look back through 2,000 years of Christian history, it all seems perfectly clear. But that was not the experience of those first disciples. They had no real idea what Jesus was saying. It sounded to them like he was talking about the establishment of God's kingdom. And they thought that event would occur when Jesus declared himself to be the Messianic king, and that would take place that very week. After the meal was over, Jesus and his disciples left Jerusalem and headed toward the Mount of Olives. As they neared the Mount of Olives that very week, sadness and sorrow began to come over Jesus, and he became unusually silent. Instead of continuing on to Bethany, where they had apparently been spending the night, Jesus wanted to stop and pray in a place called the Garden of Gethsemane. The name Gethsemane means olive press. It refers to a particular olive grove that contained a mill for pressing olives.
And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will."
Why was Jesus so distressed and sorrowful, even to the point of death? And why had his mood changed so drastically from earlier in the night? The answer to those questions are found in the words of Jesus' prayer. He was struggling in the garden with the hour and the cup. In Old Testament biblical prophecy, the word hour often refers to events that are determined or appointed by God. And the word cup refers to suffering or to God's judgment. These two words are metaphors that refer to what Jesus believed was his God-given destiny. In the garden, Jesus was struggling with the conviction that he had come to earlier in his ministry and what he had reaffirmed that night in the upper room with his disciples. It was his conviction that it was only through his death that deliverance could come to God's people. Jesus believed he was the suffering servant of the Lord in Isaiah, and that it was his destiny to take upon himself the fate that Israel had suffered at the hand of pagans for centuries. But even though he felt that his suffering was necessary, that it would result in a new exodus and the end of Israel's exile, Jesus was still human. And as he faced the betrayal of Judas, his coming abandonment, and the suffering he knew he would experience, he wavered. Mark's account indicates that Jesus nearly suffered a mental breakdown from extreme emotional distress as he almost grieved to the point of death. In the moment of his greatest need, Jesus returns to his disciples 3 times seeking their support, but each time he finds them sleeping. The disciples were totally oblivious to the nature of the struggle that Jesus was facing that night in the garden. He had always been there for them, but they failed him the time he needed them most. It is at that moment that Jesus sees the torches. It's Judas and those who've come to arrest him. But it's at that exact moment that everything suddenly changes. All the sadness and sorrow that has so wrung the heart of Jesus is suddenly replaced with determination. He had made his decision. He had not come to Jerusalem merely to celebrate the Passover. He had come as Israel's long-awaited Messianic king. He had accepted what he believed was God's will for his life. And with that conviction, Jesus resolutely wakes his disciples.
Rise up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.
Instead of trying to save his life by fleeing into the darkness, Jesus initiates the encounter with Judas. Jesus goes forward to meet Judas and those who had come with him. He is the Messianic king. He will not turn back. And as king, he goes forth to fight and defeat the enemies of God's people. He has come to Jerusalem to claim his crown, and nothing will cause him to turn back now. Jesus did receive a crown later that day, but it was no royal diadem. It was simply a crown of thorns. How could what started as a week full of such glorious messianic expectation end with the crucifixion and the eventual death of Jesus? What did Jesus think would happen when he surrendered himself that night? What did he hope to accomplish? Did his plans go tragically wrong? Join me next time as we seek to answer these very important questions in the final chapters of Mark's Gospel.